Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. And my guest today is returning guest Thomas P. Seager. So Tom, welcome back to the show, brother.
This is my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So Tom, you're an engineer. You're certainly a biohacker to every in every ounce of the word. So just tell us a little bit more about yourself. I know that you've already been on the show, and some people know who you are, but just so for the people who don't know, just give us a little bit of a brief background.
I went to school for environmental engineering. So this is the 80s when environmental was new, and it was all about clean air and clean water and cleaning up hazardous waste. And, when I was a young man, I thought I was going to learn how to save the world. But I didn't get my PhD until 2001. And by then, the environmental concerns had changed. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are doing a good job. The EPA Superfund program had kind of played itself out. And the concerns in 2001 were more about sustainability and climate change. Even the ozone hole was getting resolved by then. And so everything became more complex. By the time I got to Arizona State University, I'm now a faculty member in the School of Sustainable Engineering. My career had changed to disaster response, infrastructure resilience. How do we bring the society back after Katrina or after the earthquake or whatever it was? And I still had this sort of ethic of saving the world, because I guess I'm a little conceited, Mike, but I have this idea that I'm going to do some good out there as an engineer.
And I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's bad.
It's not a bad thing, right?
It's not a bad thing. And I was chatting with John Gordon yesterday, and we were talking about, the benefits of ego, but we won't get into that too much today. You go ahead and kind of finish off.
It can be sort of, how do you use your ego? And my ego, I feel better about myself when I feel like I'm doing something for society. And then COVID happened, and they locked me out of my classroom. And they made me wear a mask and do this social distancing on campus. And I was a pretty vocal critic to the extent that Twitter would allow me to be, or YouTube would allow me to be. And I lost a lot of friends because social media and the mainstream media came at me pretty hard there. We published an article, me and AJK writer, called "The Curve is Already Flat." And it used the CDC data to show that COVID was in community spread long before the lockdowns, and the lockdowns were pointless. That got censored. My career changed because the disaster is not a hurricane or an earthquake. The disaster was that policy response of lockdowns. And so I started thinking about my profession and my training in a different way. Environmental engineering really started with the cholera epidemic in London. There was a physician who put a map up on the wall. There's a book about it called The Ghost Map, because he put a pin in every cholera death. And he noticed that the pins on this map all surrounded one well in London. He said, I'm going to go down to that well and I'm taking the handle off the pump so that nobody can use it anymore.
What year was this in London when all this was going on?
That's a really good question. I think this is 19th century, but if we're going to look it up, cholera epidemic London ghost map, we're going to find online a more exact year. This is Dr. John Snow in 1854. He creates, now we would call it a geographic information system, Mike, because we got to use technology. But he creates this wall with this map of all the deaths. He recognizes the cluster around the well. He disables the pump so that people can't drink that poison water anymore, and the cholera epidemic resolves itself. Now something clicks in the engineering mind, and it says, hey, people need clean water. They didn't need a vaccine against cholera. They needed clean water so that they wouldn't wind up infected and diseased. That was the genesis of environmental engineering.
And maybe we should just explain to people what cholera is, Tom, because some people may not know what it is.
It's a deadly infectious disease that is carried by water. People used to think it was like foul air. There were a lot of misconceptions about it.
It's a gastrointestinal disease largely, correct?
Right. It's going to kill you through either dehydration because you can't stop the diarrhea or some combination of malnutrition. It's disgusting because if you don't separate the sewage from the drinking water, the symptoms of the disease cause a greater spread of the disease. So you get this positive feedback loop where more and more people are getting infected. That was an analogy to where I found myself during the lockdowns. We have this new disease, and I don't want to argue about the origins of viruses or things like that. The fact was, people felt sick, and the lockdowns were not the right way to treat it. It got me thinking about what is it in nature that keeps us healthy? I've never got COVID. I've been tested 9 times because my university requires it. 2 blood samples, all the rest saliva samples, and I can't catch this dang, most infective disease ever. And I'm not sure exactly why, but my vitamin D is in a good place. My cold exposure is in a good place. My metabolism is in a good place. And we know that COVID fatality rates were related to metabolic dysfunction. So what do people need? They still need sort of the clean air and the clean water, but for the most part, the basic sanitation problems have been solved. Now we find that people need light. They need good light hygiene, dark nights, bright days. They need sunshine, not sunscreen. They need more sunshine. They need sleep. They need to get the seed oils and the processed foods out of their diet. They need to get back to whole foods, and they need cold. So I doubled down on the whole ice bath business. I said, my job as an engineer is to create the machines that are the second best thing to nature. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm downtown on the 32nd floor. I can't get out to the ocean or to the forest and all these natural environments that will heal me. So I got to get the machines, make the machines that are going to bring those elements of nature to me and give my body the conditions that it needs to stay healthy on its own.
Well, you know what? You kind of answered one of the questions that I was going to ask you just by, saying what you just said. What I was going to ask you was, how does an engineer think differently than a doctor when it comes to health? Because I do like chatting with engineers about health. I find them to be very, very specific, which I like. They're generally speaking, they're very meticulous people, they're very objective, and they like to really, count things. They want to know, exactly what they're doing. So the engineers are more likely, say, to count calories, measure food, and that kind of thing, say, when they're trying to lose weight, than say someone who maybe isn't an engineer. So
it's true.
For the
We're a bunch of
common
nerds.
So for the people listening, how does an engineer think a little bit differently than a doctor when it comes to medicine?
My job is to put you out of business, Dr. Hart. If I do a good job of structuring the environment around the person, if building the good buildings and the good roads, then you don't get the infectious disease. If the water were clean in London, there never would have been any cholera patients for Dr. Snow to treat in the first place. If the highways are good and the cars are safe, you don't have any trauma victims coming into your ER anymore. The engineers, they save lives, so to speak, millions at a time because we're reorganizing the environment in which people live. They can also destroy lives millions at a time by creating the machines and the infrastructure that keeps you sick. Red light is a great example. We have super high efficiency window glazing. In Toronto, it's really important because the building code standards are structured for energy efficiency. You put these super windows in, and what do? They isolate the occupants of the building from those aspects of the sunshine that people really need. In Phoenix, that aspect is infrared light. You'd think that people in Phoenix have plenty of sunshine, plenty of light, because it's so bright here all the time, but they don't. It gets so hot in Phoenix that people never go outside. Instead, they stay behind, their super infrared reflective glass windows, so they have a little bit of the visible spectrum, but they wind up IR deficient. And this is what I mean by building the wrong buildings that make people sick. My job is to make sure they never have to reach you, Mike. You mostly are working inside the body. I'm mostly working outside the body. How do I structure the environment around the body so that all the internal things are happening? Here's the biggest thing that got stolen from us: the idea that the body can heal itself. Now, when a patient goes to see a doctor, the doctor thinks the right question is, what drug should I prescribe? And the engineer is like, that's totally the wrong question. Thank God I've never been to medical school, because for me, the right question is, what do we need to do around this body? How do we need to restructure its environment so that it can heal itself?
Excellent. So, I know you've got a couple great products out there now that you think obviously are, fantastic at healing themselves. So, maybe we'll start there. So, you got the green lamp. You also got the cold bath or that you're using as well, the cold plunge. Maybe we'll just start with the cold plunge because I know, that's kind of your baby, but we will obviously get into the green goggles and the green lamp later. And, I got my green lamp here as we were discussing before the show. But, the cold plunging thing, that's taken off even more and more since we last chatted, a year or two ago. If someone wants to get into cold plunging, like what would be the reason for them doing it? And what would be the, initial sort of protocol that you would recommend for someone who just wanted to start off getting into it?
I can tell you, I started with cold showers. This was a winter in Phoenix, and it must have been 7 or 8 years ago, because I read a book. It was Mike Cernovich's Guerrilla Mindset. Before he became this like political journalist or something, he wrote this book called Guerrilla Mindset. I was separated from my wife, and I'm like, okay, I want a guerrilla mindset. And in there he goes, you should take cold showers. It'll toughen you up. Like, okay, I want to be tough. By cold, we're talking like 55 degrees, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That was it. And I hated every minute of every cold shower that I ever took.
And
But
how
then,
many minutes were you doing that when you
oh,
first
not even
initiated it?
like 45 seconds. I was in there like this. Screw you, sir, it sucks. And then I would get out as soon as I could stand it because I didn't know anything. I didn't know to breathe. I thought the way you get through a cold shower is you just swear at the top of your lungs. I was really fighting it at that point. It wasn't until later when I'd read more about Wim Hof and structuring your breathing and strengthening your vagal tone and your parasympathetic nervous system that I understood what was happening to me in those first cold showers. But an ice bath, whole body cold water immersion, totally different, because you get the mammalian dive reflex. In the shower, you're just doing partial body. When you do whole body, then something in your nervous system knows you're getting ready to dive. It will slow down your heart rate. It will slow down the rate of oxygen consumption. And it says, all right, we need to conserve and calm because maybe Tom's going to go down and get some lobster. Maybe he's going spear fishing or he's foraging. Like this must be the ice age all over again, like those ancient ancestors. And we need to do this right so that he can get the food he needs and survive. Now, there's no lobster in my Morozko, but I'm activating that sort of ancient autonomic response. I emerge with better heart rate variability, better parasympathetic vagal tone is sort of this term that people use to describe the parasympathetic division of the central nervous system. So there are two reasons to get started. And one is metabolic. This is the one that most people are familiar with. You don't have any brown fat because you've been staying too warm for too long. You get into the cold, and at first, maybe for 2 weeks, you're shivering. The muscles are doing the shivering job of thermogenesis to try and thermoregulate in a difficult cold environment. But after about 2 weeks, you've done what's called beiging the white fat, built new mitochondria inside certain white fat cells that do the job of brown fat. Infants can't shiver. Infants are born with copious quantities of brown fat to keep them warm because their muscles are not fully developed enough to shiver. And then gradually people lose brown fat as they grow up, unless they get cold, in which case they can retain or recruit brown fat. Why is that important? Brown fat is primarily responsible for cold thermogenesis, but it has two other functions, and one is to modulate the thyroid. So brown fat is in constant communication with your thyroid. They work together to regulate your metabolism. If you lose all your brown fat, it's no wonder your thyroid becomes dysregulated. And there's some terrific case studies. This is Hashimoto's, this is Graves'. So either hypo or hyperthyroidism, resolved by cold plunge. Why? Because once you restore the brown fat to the body, the thyroid has something to remodulate its function, to keep it in a healthy range rather than becoming dysregulated. So that's one, is the metabolic benefits. But the other aspect is that brown fat is also an essential secretory organ. It will, for example, be associated with more brain derived neuroprotective factor in the body or more FGF21. These neurochemicals that help repair brain damage, that help postpone cognitive decline in old age, and that are good for brain health. Without brown fat, you age faster, both metabolically and neurologically. So, brown fat isn't something that's sort of nice to have. It is something that your body is wired for, that you're supposed to retain by periodically getting cold. It's a really good reason. And that's not really why I do it anymore. the,
So it's that's a fantastic answer, and I want to get back into it, but it sounds so like counterintuitive, I think, for maybe people who are listening, because you're saying that, by getting inside the cold plunge, you're adding a layer of fat. But again, it's not the fat that we're talking about, like, the adipose tissue that people are, trying to get rid of to, make themselves more metabolically healthy, make themselves more maybe, aesthetically pleasing to others, that kind of thing. What we're talking about is the brown fat that you're talking about that has like some really good, healthy metabolic functions. And so,
Correct.
I think that that's very, very sort of like a counterintuitive, point about cold plunges. So, is that something that when you discuss with people, like a lot of people are really surprised about this like increase in brown fat, like when you get into a cold plunge, like what's been the reaction?
By the time people get to me, they've already done some reading, they've watched some videos. When I talk to them, they have an idea. They might not realize the totality of it, but they know they're able to make the distinction. It turns out there are four types of fat. There's subcutaneous fat, and that's the fat, where you can pinch an inch. I've got plenty of that. There's visceral fat, and visceral fat is much more dangerous than subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat layers around the organs inside the torso of the body, and it's associated with increased mortality. Then there's fat that's actually inside your cells, not your fat cells necessarily, but lipids that are stored inside muscle cells and other cells. And that stuff is terrible. Talk about insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. It's not where fat belongs. But the fourth one is the brown fat. And so, if you've been listening to some people that have been, I don't know, making the rounds, people like Casey Means, then you're learning more about fat. Sean O'Mara is another one who'll talk
He
about
was
the difference
on here
between,
recently. He was,
there you
I think,
go,
my
right?
second or third last guest, and
Yep.
so we
And
talked
he'll
about
do a
visceral fat.
scan and he'll show you visceral versus subcutaneous. And he'll say, look, this visceral fat is killing you. That's what gives you like the pot belly. And he's got a great point. So the brown fat that we're talking about here is not fat that shows up in the mirror. It's clustered around the clavicles, the back of the neck. It's positioned so that when your heart is supplying blood to your brain and the brown fat is active for cold thermogenesis, it will warm that blood up before it gets up to the brain. The fat, I mean, your body knows what to do in the cold. It will create these fat depots, mostly around the base of the neck, a little bit around the heart, that are going to protect your vital organs, in particular your brain, when you're doing the extreme cold exposure. You're not going to see the brown fat in the mirror. You need a PET scan to locate it in your body. And when the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York did like 10,000 scans and they reviewed them, they found that 95% of their patients had no detectable brown fat. So this is what's happening if you don't get cold periodically. You lose the essential functions that this brown fat performs.
Wow. So you're saying that 95% of the people that they studied didn't have any brown fat. So we're talking about only 1 out of 20 people in the entire study did have brown fat.
Yep.
Um, so just want to come back again to, maybe protocols and just to maybe simplify things a little bit. So in terms of the cold plunge versus the cold shower. You mentioned the mammalian reflex. Maybe you can chat about that a little bit more. And then also with regards to the brown fat. So are you indicating that if someone does a cold shower, yeah, sure, they may get a little bit of like dopamine response and that kind of thing. But in terms of getting the mammalian reflex and then also the brown fat, is it essential that they have to get into a cold plunge?
The shower will activate your brown fat. Now, if I'm on the road and I'm at a hotel or something, I'm going to do a cold shower. I keep it off the top of my head. I let it over the front of my chest and I let it go over the shoulders on my back. And I'm keeping it away from my extremities. I tell myself this story, like, just pour it over your brown fat, Tom. The cold shower will activate your sympathetic nervous system. You know this because you hate it. You get in there and you're like, what am I doing? I got to get myself out of here. That fight or flight response is activated in the cold shower and is the nervous system.
Why do you avoid, though, putting it on your head when you're in the shower? And why would you avoid putting it on your limbs?
Because I had an experience in Banff. So this is the Canadian Rockies, and I was there for some science workshop thing. And it was summertime. It was gorgeous. But dang, Mike, that water is cold. It's melting right off the glaciers. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a cold shower. And I didn't know at the time what I was doing. And I let it pour over the top of my head. And I gave myself a brain freeze. And I felt like an idiot when I got to go look like a smart scientist. So I don't do that anymore. When I'm in the ice bath, I will do a head dunk. But when I'm doing cold showers, I don't let the water pour over the top of my head because I don't want that brain freeze. I want it on my brown fat to activate that, get the metabolic benefits.
But is there any benefit of, like you said, you do dunk your head? Like, what is the benefit of dunking your head, and what would be, the consequences of you not dunking it?
I think it's probably no consequences of not dunking your head. I think it's probably fine. If you don't want to dunk, don't dunk. I do it because it's part of my routine. It's a little more challenging psychologically for me. At the worst, it gives me some flashbacks. I remember an experience. It was a 50-degree Fahrenheit tub. And so for me, that's not very cold. It's boring. And I was at a friend's house doing it. And he's like, well, if that's boring, then I'll give you a snorkel. And you can go under. Let's see, he's kind of challenging me. And I couldn't turn him down. He was doing cold plunge because he has Parkinson's. And he knew that the cold plunge would elevate his dopamine without him taking exogenous L-Dopa. And he had this theory that maybe the cold would extend his healthy lifespan without the exogenous dopamine, so his dopamine receptors wouldn't burn out. And I saw improvements in his gait and his coordination. So, what am I going to do? Tell him, no, I'm not tough enough to do the snorkel. He gives me the snorkel, I go under. I had an incredible emotional flashback experience of my mother teaching me how to swim. She's going to hold you up. You're going to do a back float or something. And this is the way my mother did it anyway. And then ultimately, you want to get rolled over so you can do the dead man's float, and you're going to have a lot of I'm 4 years old or something like that. And somehow, like in that 50-degree water with that snorkel, my mother came back to me, and she still does sometimes when I do the head dunk. I don't do the head dunk because of anything related to brown fat. I do the head dunk because it scares the shit out of me. And I figure I should challenge myself at that edge. The farthest I've ever gone is 11 seconds underwater in the cold bath before I panic and I come up. That's okay. Maybe someday I'll hit 12, but I hit that psychological edge, which is the other reason for starting a cold practice. It's what Joe Rogan talks about when he says, I get up in the morning and I go out there in my underwear and it's wintertime and it's cold and there's no negotiation. I just get in, because if I don't, he feels like somehow his inner bitch won, like he's some kind of a wimp. Maybe this is a self-esteem problem, Mike, but I have the same kind of thing. I want to challenge myself at that edge that scares me. And then the whole rest of the day doesn't seem like any big deal.
Yeah, well, I think that, what you're doing there is obviously, and you talk about this all the time, but building resilience. And I think the part of your brain, it's your angular cingulate cortex, actually gets bigger once you do things that you don't want to do. So even if you are going for like, maybe if David Goggins goes for, a 10-mile run, he doesn't build anything in his angular cingulate cortex because it's just so easy for him. But for, anyone else doing anything, and for David Goggins doing things that challenge him, when you do things that challenge yourself voluntarily, then you can, build your angular cingulate cortex. And also too, to point, what you said, like it makes the rest of your day easier. I think that's an important point because again, you're voluntarily doing something that's difficult. So when you voluntarily do something that's difficult, when you have to do something that's, involuntary that you necessarily don't want to do, it just makes that a little bit easier, I think, for the rest of the day.
Yep.
Just coming back though to the mammalian reflex again, and comparing cold showers to the cold plunge. So you indicated that we would get the mammalian reflex by getting into the cold plunge. We wouldn't get that by going into the cold shower. So what is the benefit of the mammalian reflex?
The cold shower activates the sympathetic division of the central nervous system. Brown fat is highly innervated. So what that means is it's directly connected to the brain because it has all this nerve tissue in it. You say, well, what the hell would it have all the nerve tissue? It is activated by the hypothalamus in the brain. So the thermal receptors in the skin send the signal up to the brain, and then the brain goes through the nervous system to turn on your brown fat. That sympathetic nervous system reaction is your fight or flight. Like, you're going to die, get the hell out of here. What are you thinking? And it takes about 30 seconds for the neurotransmitters, for the dopamine, for the noradrenaline, for the adrenaline, for all these other neurochemicals that your body's responding or is producing in response to reach your brain and calm you down. This is when your parasympathetic division takes over. The gasp reflex is when you first get in, and the dive reflex is when you're ready to stay in. The difference is maybe 30 seconds. I sometimes see this. My daughter was classic for this. She would get in and she'd say, my toes hurt, my fingers are terrible. And then 30 seconds later, why am I smiling? Well, she's smiling because all of those neurotransmitters are now acting in her brain. When you go whole body, your heart rate will go down. Your blood glucose, which initially spikes as part of the sympathetic nervous system activation, the liver says, oh my gosh, we gotta go. We gotta power these muscles. Here's the glycogen into the bloodstream that then dissociates into glucose so that the muscles have the energy that they need. But it doesn't last very long. Continuous glucose monitoring data shows that when you go whole body, that blood glucose spike might take a healthy person up to as much as 140. And 30 seconds later, they're on their way back down to 90 because the glucose stores, they're very limited. The body also releases lipids from the white fat cells that get carried to the brown fat for combustion, for oxidation, to release heat into these other metabolic products that do not produce ATP. They just release the heat to defend your core body temperature. The mammalian dive reflex is relaxing, which is this most surprising counterintuitive thing. But I've put Muse headsets on to measure brainwave data and look at people getting into the ice bath, compare them to when they're meditating, when they're warm and dry on their yoga mat. And experienced meditators can put themselves in that calm, meditative brainwave state. But it doesn't matter. Even the inexperienced people who get into the ice bath, boom, they drop right down into that calm meditative and they stay there for the 2 to 4 minutes that we're putting them in there for.
Okay, so that was a really good explanation, and I really want to get into some of like the protocols here before we start talking about green light. So in terms of the protocol for, getting a cold shower or getting in a cold plunge, you recommend about 2 to 4 minutes per day. Is that correct?
That's what I do. And it works really well for me.
And then something that I do is, and I've heard Andrew Huberman kind of do the opposite of this sometimes, but I prefer to get out of the shower cold, or if I ever did a cold plunge, I prefer to stay cold after. Like, I don't like going back to the heat because I find that, I need the cold then to kind of like just, sink in. And then that sort of helps me, get that dopamine rush, I think, anyway, through the rest of the day. Maybe I'm wrong. Like, but I see people all the time going back between heat and cold. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I do use a sauna. I use it more or less every day, and I, get a cold shower almost every day, but I don't do them back to back like a lot of people do. Like, and again, like, I don't really have any scientific basis for this. I'm, kind of asking you a question here, and something I need to research more. But for my understanding, like, it's the same thing with the heat and with the cold. Like, I sort of just like to let it like percolate for a little bit instead of like, going back and forth. And so when you tell people to get in the cold, like, do you usually mix the heat after, or do you tell them just to get out and stay cold? Because I prefer to stay cold.
Huberman and Soberg talked about this a little bit. They're like, finish on cold, let your body rewarm naturally. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach, but they are primarily concerned with burning fat, burning calories, maintaining body composition. Cold is not the greatest for that. You can't cold exposure your way to a ripped physique. And Mike, I'm proof. I'm 27% body fat according to my DEXA scan that I just had like 2 months ago. And that is clinically obese. I also have testosterone levels that are over 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. And these two things, you don't usually see them together. It's rare.
Good job on that.
I'll tell you why. We'll get to how testosterone is sensitized and the essential role of the mitochondria and how these two things can coexist, but they typically don't, because the same conditions that lead to obesity, a crappy diet, a sedentary lifestyle, a lack of sunshine, they're the same conditions that typically lead to obesity. So it's very unusual in America to be metabolically healthy and still have so much subcutaneous fat that you're considered obese. And I guess I'm an exception. The point that I'm trying to make is cold is not a weight loss aid unless you are in such poor condition to start with that you're metabolically dysregulated. You get some brown fat, you get some insulin sensitivity, you can lose several pounds, and sometimes it's 10 or 15, depending upon your starting point, by adding cold. But it is not going to get you down to the like 15% body fat level just because you're burning so many calories.
But what about what I'm kind of asking though is, like, when you get out of a cold shower or out of a cold plunge, should you stay cold, or should you, or is it okay to heat back up? Because most people want to do this because they want to, a boost in dopamine for the next 2 to 6 hours. So if you could just answer that question specifically.
You're fine if you want to heat up. There's nothing
You're
wrong
fine if
with
you want to
heating
heat up. So you're still going to get the dopamine rush even after you've done it. Interesting. Okay.
But I live in Phoenix. For me, heating up is like parking my car in the sunshine, because I'm going to get up to, 60 degrees Celsius in that car. That's my sauna. So if you want to do thermal contrast, combine the wet cold with the dry heat. This is really important. It's very healthy to go back and forth. The people in the US who cite these, Finnish epidemiological studies, and they say, oh, look, 30% drop in mortality if you sauna. They don't realize that sauna is a Finnish word. It's the only Finnish word that has been like adopted in the English language. But if you go to Finland, it means hot and cold. And the studies say that right in their experimental method. The people are leaving the sauna and they're jumping in the snow, or they're jumping in the lake, and then they go back in the sauna. The benefits that the study cites are not from heat alone. It's from hot and cold. It's from thermal contrast. And it's very good for your circulatory system, because the cold causes vasoconstriction. The heat causes vasodilation. So now you're exercising the smooth muscle tissue that control your circulation when you go back and forth, back and forth. This is a wonderful thing to do. There's nothing wrong with ending on cold. But if you've got a meeting coming up, if you're trying to get ready for a podcast or something, and you don't want to feel like you're on the edge of shivering for the next 45 minutes, it's okay to end with the heat. Here's the protocol that I like the best. Do the cold, then do some exercise. Not even a lot of exercise. It could be squats, push-ups. I have my steel mace. That's one of my favorites. Pull-ups. I can do 3, Mike. but at least I do them, you know? The idea is to get your limbs moving again, to restore the circulation to your limbs. And it is this exercise after the cold that is essential for men to get an immediate testosterone boost. Now, if you're going to work out hard, it doesn't take a lot of exercise to get the testosterone boost. It could be like do a brisk walk for a mile, run some stairs, something like that would be fine. But if you're going to exercise hard, use the sauna to recover. So the stack that is my favorite is cold, exercise, and you're feeling cold while you exercise, and then the sauna. Because there's some good science that the heat is way better for your long-term recovery. We know that the cold after exercise will reduce inflammation, reduce delayed onset muscle soreness, but it will not help you build stronger muscles. Sauna will do that.
But it'll decrease hypertrophy. So people are saying that you should always do, like you just said, do the cold before. And but also though too, it may even give you, I don't know if this has been teased out in literature yet, but it may even give you a little bit of like a performance boost if you're, feeling a little bit sluggish there as well, I imagine.
There's a lot of noise in that data. The athletes who use the cold to recover so they can come back and perform the next day are those in the tournament sports like tennis or even golf. So let's say it's the US Open, it's the summertime, it's hot, and you need to advance up the rounds. Use the ice bath after your match because it will reduce the delayed onset muscle soreness. It will get you back to performance level faster. And part of that is psychological. The athletes say, I feel better, I feel more ready for the next competition. But they're not in training, they're in competition. If you're training, for goodness sakes, if you're doing the Tour de France, do the ice bath after every leg. But if you're in training for the Tour de France, pre-cool. Don't use the ice bath to cut your testosterone, to cut your anabolic gains. Use the ice bath to pre-cool your workout so you can work harder and postpone your fatigue. It's the same thing, by the way, in tennis. They might be better off pre-cooling their match so that they can have greater endurance, greater peak muscle power output. This work is coming out of Craig Heller's lab at Stanford University, and it's extremely convincing, both with trained athletes and untrained athletes, that cooling during exercise protects the mitochondria, reduces the production of reactive oxygen species, and allows them to put out more energy to the muscles that improves the athlete's performance.
So you're saying training in cool would be good then? Because that's, again, a little bit counterintuitive in some ways, because some guys love, just training in the heat. You know what I mean? I don't know if I say I love training in the heat. I'm probably actually one who probably prefers a little bit actually training in the cool. But a lot of people do really prefer training in heat for whatever reason. On the topic of temperature, though, I want to ask you, like, do you check your body temperature, and do you check it in the morning, and do you check it like before and after you get into the cold plunge? Is that something that you would recommend? Is there any data on that, or?
There is some data. The most interesting data is Tim Noakes. He's a South African physician, and he was supervising Lewis Pugh. So Lewis Pugh is this extreme polar swimmer. He swims to the North Pole, and he's going to swim to Antarctica, and he's training for that. And Tim Noakes is monitoring his core body temperature. Noakes noticed that Pugh's body temperature went up before he dove into the cold water. And he coined this term, anticipatory thermogenesis. Pugh's mind, he's imagining what this swim is going to be like. And his mind is activating his brown fat before he even gets into the water. Noakes was the first person to realize that this could happen. And now other people who are measuring their temperature have reported to me that the same thing, right? They're staring down at the ice and their core body temperature starts going up even before they get in. Now, I'm not monitoring mine. If I were doing a science project in anticipatory thermogenesis, then that's what I would have to do. But me, I'm not worried about the thermodynamic mechanisms anymore. I'm getting in there for the psychological benefits. For me,
Okay.
I need that experience of releasing my anxieties and my stress into the cold water, coming out and feeling like $1,000,000 and I'm ready to take on the world.
Yeah. So you like doing it basically for like that parasympathetic effect that you get, after the 30 seconds of, say, sympathetic effect, you just feel like it calms you down, and then you feel better afterwards.
The first 15 seconds, the 15 seconds before I get in are the worst. Then I get in and it's bad. And then after 30 seconds, I'm like, Tom, what were you even worried about? What's the big deal here? There's nothing to be afraid of. And this happens to me every time, Mike.
Well, I guess, but that's a good thing, because if it was, easy, then you wouldn't be building, that part of your brain, and you wouldn't, have that resistance that you're building. And then maybe you'd have to do, something crazy or something even more extreme. But, you get to do something that's, extremely well controlled, well researched. Obviously, you can get in trouble if you go in there for too long and that kind of thing. But you're doing something that's very, very well controlled, very well researched, and that gives you great benefits overall. One thing that I wanted to ask you about too. So we talked about the increase in brown fat being counterintuitive. I think this is even more counterintuitive. So, and I only learned this recently, embarrassingly enough, like maybe in the past 6 to 12 months or so, I learned this. So you can actually get heat shock proteins from doing a cold plunge, which again sounds so counterintuitive, because, we hear about heat shock proteins all the time from saunas. I think it was really Dr. Rhonda Patrick who really kind of, made that really, really popular on some of the appearances she made on Joe Rogan. But in terms of like the heat shock proteins, can you just explain to people, first of all, what they are? And then also, can you explain how the cold plunge actually induces heat shock proteins?
This is the inside the body stuff at which I am not the expert, Mike. Here's what I can say. The training, the thermoregulatory training that you're doing in the cold, it's like a 60 to 8% overlap to improve your tolerance to heat. So if you're just doing cold and you're not doing any sauna, you will find that your thermoregulatory system is also adapting to the heat. I know this partly because it gets over 45 degrees C here in Phoenix. And a great way to cool off is an ice bath. But if I don't have an ice bath, I'm just walking around campus, between my classes or something like that, I'm not bitching about it. I don't worry about it. A lot of the thermoregulatory mechanisms that will protect your core body temperature, that will maintain homeostasis in the cold, are the same that maintain homeostasis in the heat. Now, many of them are different. You don't sweat in the cold. You sweat in the heat. But things like vasoconstriction, vasodilation, the circulatory system that will redistribute blood throughout your body, there are the same mechanisms that maintain thermal homeostasis in the cold as in the heat. So the heat shock proteins, not my area of expertise. There are also cold shock proteins. There was a recent study at University of Rochester that wanted to understand the bowhead whale. The dominant theory of cancer is that it results from mutations that exist inside the cell nucleus. So your DNA accumulates these defects, and then over time, those defects can manifest as a tumor that becomes cancerous. But the problem is that the bowhead whale was this massive creature that lives 200 years. It should be riddled with tumors by the time it's 75, and it's not. So these University of Rochester researchers, they wanted to know why. And they discovered that cold shock proteins have the ability to repair defects in nucleic DNA. This is a mind-blowing mechanism that they hypothesized prevents the accumulation of those DNA defects that would result in cancer in a long-lived mammal like the bowhead whale. So you have some of these responses overlap. It's no surprise that heat shock proteins should be induced by cold, because the thermoregulatory mechanisms are they're about homeostasis for both cold and hot. But there are some that are specific to heat and some that are specific to cold. And in this case of the cold shock proteins repairing defects in DNA, it's profound what the implications for cancer patients might be.
That's incredible. Yeah. And again, I'll be honest, I didn't even know what cold shock proteins were, and even that they existed, until you just said that. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. So before we get into the green goggles, anything else that you want to discuss about the cold or the cold plunge?
There's a story behind the cold plunge. During the ice age, let's say it's 75,000 years ago, there was an ice age, a volcano erupts. We get like several years of just winter. Only about 5,000 Homo sapiens on the whole planet. And they're all clustered around the coast. At least this is what the fossil records tell us, somewhere on the coast of Africa. How do you think they survived that ice age with no summer? Well, they must have been cold adapted. And what were the mechanisms of thermogenesis that kept them alive when there was no harvest and the land animals became so scarce? They go into the cold water to forage. We have the same mitochondrial DNA that our ancient ancestors from 75,000 years ago. We are adapted to the cold. So the message here is it's not a nice to have. It's not a trendy fad, even if it looks good on Instagram. Is an essential part of taking care of your body to get some cold. How much? Susanna Soberg surveyed her winter swimmers in Denmark, and they said, well, we do an average of 11. So she goes on 11 minutes a week. She goes on Huberman, she says, 11 minutes a week is the magic number. I don't think so. That's just the average of these winters. You could probably get away with less. You could probably take a few days off. I go every day, 2 to 4 minutes a day. But it's not like my brown fat is going to disappear if I just take a couple of weeks off. It's fine. Psychologically, I become a little bit of a cold wimp. If I went to Cartagena, Colombia for a NATO workshop. It was a research thing. The Army asked me to come down there, and it's warm. They don't even have cold showers.
Usually people don't go to Cartagena for that, but go ahead. I've never been to Cartagena, but
you have?
I've never been there, but I know a lot of friends who have been there, and they weren't going there for workshop.
They probably have other things in mind than doing a NATO workshop to represent the Army Corps of Engineers for the United States. But that's what I was there for. When I got back, man, I felt like I'd lost my psychological cold adaptation. And this is an interesting segue into the green, because one of the guys that I do this research with, he came to visit me in Phoenix, and we were talking about ice baths and green light. And he took the green light into the cold with him. He's not cold adapted. He lives in California and he enjoys the beach, but he wears a wetsuit when he goes in there. So he's not one of these routine cold plungers, but he said, hey, I want to try these together. And he put it right up against his face. I put his picture on Instagram. He didn't shiver. And said, I'm like, okay, well, we got to try this another day, but without the green light. Next day, he feels the urge to shiver. Green light, no urge to shiver. Now, this is very curious. What would it be about the green light that calms the system down, that removes the urge to shiver? And the green light was really just an accident for me. I'm doing my biohacking thing and I'm trying to write my chapter on cold and autoimmune disorders. And vitamin D turns out to be critical in the origin of autoimmune disorders, and not necessarily the vitamin D levels that you have in adulthood when multiple sclerosis might show up, or not necessarily the vitamin D levels that you have when type 1 diabetes shows up or rheumatoid arthritis, but the vitamin D levels that you have when your immune system was in its formative stages in the first year of life. It turns out to be critical. So I'm like, okay, I got to understand vitamin D. I got to understand light. I got to understand how people like my ancient ancestors survived in, the North Sea without vitamin D. And Google figured out that I was looking at light. And they sent me a paper and said, in their Google way, hey, Professor Seager, you might be interested in this paper. It's green light for treating migraine headaches. Well, HAK, she gets migraine headaches. And I'm like, okay, I am. Way to go, Google. I'm interested. Turns out that narrow band LED green, just green, you have to exclude all other wavelengths, will reduce the pain of headaches. And it's not by a little bit, Mike. It's by a lot. So I got this device made by a friend of mine, Scott Chiveri at Mito Red Light. He takes a red light, and I said, Scott, will you just put green LEDs in there? These are the wavelengths that I want. Can you get your manufacturer to do that? And he says, yeah, sure. Thing shows up a few weeks later. Scott turns it on and he goes, "Oh, Tom, this green light is garbage. It's too bright. These red light, they always want to put more power in. And sorry, it just didn't work out the way we hoped." Me and AJK, we drive over there. We say, "We got to see this thing for ourselves." And I'm like, "Oh, Scott, you're right. This is going to give me a headache, if I stare at this thing." And AJ says, "Let me see that." She closes her eyes. She's got a headache. She says she's at about a 6. She puts the light right up here and she says, "This feels really good." It takes me down to a 2. And that's when it hit me. Closing your eyes blocks out all the other wavelengths of light. You don't have to sit in a dark closet or something. You just do this. And then you put the bright green, you let that shine through your eyelids. The eyelids will attenuate about 70% of the intensity of the light, but 30% still gets through. And that is enough to reduce the pain of migraine or other headaches. So I sent this to a friend who's a neuropsychologist at University of Utah. I sent it to another friend who is a chiropractor, practically lives across the street from, because they're both in Utah. I said, "I want you to use this with your patients. Tell me how it works." And they wrote back and they said, "It works like a miracle. 10 minutes of this green light therapy and migraine pain, not the brain fog, not the visual aura, but the pain in some patients entirely resolves. And in most, it gets them down to a tolerable level, like a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. So I'm like, okay, now I've got a green light device and I put it online. It's mygreenlamp.com. And we testing it with different patients. Traumatic brain injury migraine. Yeah, it helps. It got one kid in Scottsdale off his medication. Post-concussion headaches completely removes the pain. And it doesn't take very long.
And so in order to use this device, and I got one here, right here, and I appreciate you sending this to me.
Because I want you to use it with
Here
your
it is
patient.
here. And
Yeah.
so, I don't suffer from, migraines. I've never had one in my life, luckily. Headaches, maybe I'll get one every now and then. And, I am looking forward to using it for that. But in terms of like, the proper use of it, and like you said that, people have gotten excellent results from it. And so you just need to use the green light. So essentially, would you want to be, ideally in a dark room just with the green light on your head? And how far away would you leave it away from your face? And how many minutes would you leave it on if you wanted to get rid of a headache or get rid of a migraine?
The protocol that the clinicians in Utah developed was the green light comes on a stand. It's just this cheap cell phone stand. They put it on a desk. They seat the patient in front of the desk. They say, "Close your eyes and just meditate in front of the green light." It's about 6 inches away. Not, the way AJ does it, but just like this. My daughter uses it in bed. She had a sinus headache and she put it on her bedside table. She shut her eyes, let it shine on her face. 10 minutes later, sinus headache gone. And so this is like the simplest protocol. There are other green lights out there. They are more gentle. They are softer. You got to lock yourself in a dark closet and use them for like 45 minutes. But we accidentally invented like the most powerful green phototherapy device in the world and figured out you don't stare at anything. You don't want to stare at anything when you have a headache. Just close your eyes and you meditate with the green light on your face.
And what about for people who use it or have migraines, continuously, or some people have like a daily headache? Like, would they use it every day, even prior to maybe getting their headache? I mean, maybe they wake up with one every day, but do people just use it every day for prevention?
Many people do. I'll tell you one guy, I did the Mark Bell podcast. He saw my stuff on testosterone and Joe Rogan cited it. And he's like, "Hey, come on out to California. We'll do a podcast." And it's very intimidating because, there's all these muscle bound guys. And here I am, a college professor. And in the middle of the podcast, Mark says, "Well, would you talk about the green?" Because Mark Bell's podcast producer, Andrew Z, has suffered from migraines since he was like a kid, 9 years old. And he said, "I need to know, does this really work? Because the meds don't work. Nothing, Gary Brecka says, you not get enough sodium. That's not working for me. Nothing is working." I sent him a light. He sent me a message and he's like, "This thing is a goddamn miracle. Takes me from like a 9 down to a 2. I got my wife using it." And the University of Arizona protocol was an hour a day whether you have a headache or not, just to prevent the headaches. They got a 60 to 80% reduction in chronic migraine severity and frequency from this prophylactic use. So I'm like, Andrew, I don't even get headaches. I use mine every morning. You know, the days are very short. I wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, okay, let's see what's happening on Instagram. But I put my green light on so that the only light, you know, my computer or my phone is in dark mode. The only light that's really enveloping me is the green. And this isn't even for headache. When Harvard took the green light and said, we want to put it in the therapist's office. So these are people who suffer from general anxiety disorder. And we're going to do therapy under green light rather than the usual fluorescent lights of the therapist's office. They got a significant reduction in the symptoms of general anxiety disorder. Nothing else changed. You know, you go, you see your therapist, you talk about all your freaking problems and how your spouse is driving you crazy and how the rest of the world is wrong. And this is why you're depressed. And then you walk out and it doesn't do you a damn bit of good unless you did all that in the green light. And then you feel less anxious.
So basically, you know, what you're saying is it does have the potential to have other applications. Like I know that right now, you know, it seems like the only, I think, study, like peer-reviewed study is on migraines and headaches, but potentially there are other therapeutic applications to the green light. And one of them would be generalized anxiety disorder. Is that correct?
Yep. There's a clinical trial on it. Rami Burstein from Harvard University published it.
And Tom, what would be the pathophysiology behind that? Like, why would green light help with anxiety?
Nobody knows. Nobody, even the like most eminent headache, you know, doctors in the world don't know what the exact mechanism is. But I'm going to take you back to my friend who combined it with the ice bath, and he found that he didn't have the urge to shiver. Remember that the shivering is activated by the nervous system, the sympathetic division in particular. And here's a story that I'm going to tell you. There was a study of the dominant wavelengths of light around the world. They go to every forest and they measure it. Surprise, surprise, Mike, the forests are green. And so they say, what are the wavelengths in the forest? And they are the exact same all over the world, whether it's Haiti or Vermont or any shady forest that you're in, that's green light. The other wavelength is near infrared. Those are the two dominant wavelengths, one of them visible and one of them outside the visible spectrum.
No, it's just one question on that. Would you ever want to combine the two of them?
Yeah, because my friend didn't have just green light. He put the red light on the back of his head and the green light on his face, and he got this incredible calming effect. And so the story, the hypothesis here is that he recreated the dominant wavelengths in the forest. And there's some great clinical trials on forest bathing for wound healing, for depression, even for cancer recovery, for chemotherapy recovery. You go out into the forest and it only takes like 4 hours a week or something like this to get a dose that will benefit your health and mental well-being. The idea, and this is just an idea, is that my friend recreated these conditions, the light conditions of the forest on the 32nd floor at my apartment in Phoenix, and that everything calmed down so he didn't feel the same urge to shiver.
So basically what you're saying is like when you go into the forest, you know, people have experienced this common effect through nature and that kind of thing. And the common effect that they're getting potentially could be through green light and then also through near infrared light. And so combining the two may be effective. But when you're talking about patients who have migraines or headaches specifically, then you just want the green light. You do not want the red light. Is that correct?
I don't know. I have never tested the red light. I have a helmet. I don't get a lot of migraines. And the next time, next time AJK gets one, I should put her on that. She'll do the green light and it helps with her migraines. It will not help with a high estrogen headache. And so if you are a woman who, you know, every 28 days, you're like, oh, my head is pounding and you got a little diary for that, it's probably high estrogen and it sucks, but the green light won't touch it. It will relieve the pain of all the other headaches. And so next migraine she gets, she's very cautious, but I want to get the helmet on her, combine the red and the green. The thing is that it's so effective. The green alone is so effective for the pain that a cautious patient like AJ is like, no, I know what works. I don't want to mess with it. But my friend, he'll try anything at least once, you know, and see if it works.
So in terms of, pain, are you talking just about headache pain and migraine pain, or does it help with other types of pain as well?
There's another study from University of Arizona. Yeah, fibromyalgia, which is probably an autoimmune disorder. And it's the kind of thing that disproportionately impacts women. And it has both psychological and physiological origins. So they said, hey, I wonder if green's going to help with fibromyalgia patients. They ran a mini clinical trial, and it did. Those fibromyalgia patients that use the green light on a regular basis in accordance with the University of Arizona's instructions reported, again, pain is always about the self-report, reported a significant reduction in their pain experience of fibromyalgia. Now, this gets really promising. Like if green light has a calming and an analgesic effect, and it works for migraines, and it works for post-concussion headaches, and it works for sinus headaches, what else could it do? Could it work, for a sore knee? We don't know. We got to find out.
Yeah, well, we know that red light therapy, some people find it to be really effective for pain control. I know it's not everyone, but some people do. So, maybe there's other, spectrums out there too, like green light that can also be helpful. So thanks so much again for sharing, so much on green light. And thanks so much again for sending me my little one here. I'll just put this up for you again, guys. So this is it here. Really, really cool. So I know we've been chatting for an hour. I had a couple other questions that I wanted to ask. One was just regarding, what's just passed over the last week or so, or a couple weeks ago, whenever it happened, the daylight savings time. So, you're someone obviously who's really into, light, circadian rhythm, that kind of thing. Do you think that we need to just get rid of daylight savings time? What's your opinion on that?
Daylight savings time is an abomination. It's a public health abomination. It was, as far as I know, invented by Benjamin Franklin, who's a really clever guy. He's got electricity and he's such a great writer. He was sort of like the first American celebrity
But why is it bad for our health is what I'm getting at.
because it kills people. So, how does it kill people? Every time they change the clocks, traffic fatalities go up because people are tired and they're discombobulated when they're driving on the Monday after the clock change. I'm not even talking about metabolic health or circadian rhythm. I'm just talking about people getting run over because we changed the clocks. And for me, as a civil engineer, that's enough for me to say, cut that out. But I can make this a little bit more personal. When I was at Purdue University, this is Western Indiana, and Indiana, most of Indiana, is still on New York time. It makes no goddamn sense. But remember that the stock market is in New York. The financiers are in New York. The bankers are in New York. And they're the ones who funded the railroads. So you're being, railroads now, we're building tracks across America. And the railroads have to run on time. And that means you have to synchronize the clocks or the trains are going to, run into one another. So these financiers said, we want all of our train stations on our time zone. There was really no such thing as time zones until railroads and telegraph systems that accompanied them made it happen. And the bankers were like, you're on Eastern time. You're on Eastern. Why the hell is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan on Eastern time? Because there are copper mines in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They're owned by the bankers in New York. And they said, we want the miners on our time. And you got to go all the way to the edge of Chicago before, there's people populous enough and rich enough to say, screw you, New York. We're going to have our own time zone. And Indiana wasn't it. But back in that day, Indiana refused to change their clocks. They said, you know what? We're not going to have daylight savings time. And it worked out great. Then Indiana had an election, new governor. It was Mitch Daniels. He used to run the Office of Management and Budget. And he might have been a Ben Franklin or Myra, but he was a spreadsheet guy. And he said, well, for reasons of commerce, Indiana must change its clocks. Damn it, Mike. Like, I'd be trying to put my kids to bed. And they're like, Dad, it's 9:30, but it's still light out. Well, why do we have to go to sleep? And I go like, well, yeah, I know, but you do have school in the morning. It made no sense. And then, of course, in the winter, sometimes it felt like the kids were getting up and getting on the bus in the dark and coming home in the dark. Like, I liked Indiana when they didn't change their clocks. And I moved to New York. I was at Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm stuck on this daylight savings time bull crap. But then Arizona State made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I come to Arizona. You know who doesn't change their clocks? Arizona. So the whole rest of the world gets confused about what time it is, as far as I'm concerned. And some politician in Arizona says, you know what? The last thing we need in the Valley of the Sun is to save daylight. And it kind of makes sense. We don't change. And I love not changing. You change. We're 2 hours apart. We're going to be 3 hours apart in, a few more months, but it's no good for you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people now are, pushing back against this, and they see that, there's quite a bit of, health detrimental effects overall. So, I'm happy that we had this conversation today, and thanks so much for answering that.
Yeah, here's my advice. Don't take health advice from Benjamin Franklin. He suffered gout like practically his entire adult life. He used to love to stay up and play chess and games with his friends. And he figured out that if he could convince everybody to change their clocks, it would save him some money on whale oil. That's why we have daylight savings time. It's ridiculous.
Well, that's not a very good reason, and I appreciate
Right.
you. I appreciate you telling that story. So I know our hour is up there, Tom. But can you tell people where they can find more, where they can learn more about you, where they can learn more about your cold plunge, where they can learn more about your green lamp and everything else that you're doing?
I wrote this book, Uncommon Cold, the science and experience of cold plunge therapy. And you can get everything that I wrote in this book online for free at morozkoforge.com. You can't buy the book on Amazon because I haven't even uploaded it. You can buy it, if you're a hard copy kind of guy, you can buy it at Morozko Forge, but you can read all the articles. You can even buy an ice bath. We ship to Toronto. We've got several customers in Canada. So that's morozkoforge.com. The migraine lamp is separate. Brian Hoyer gave me the idea for this name, Migraine Lamp. Brian Hoyer runs Shielded Healing, and he's a very clever and creative guy. And so this is migrainelamp.com. And you can read, I have a few articles on green light, how it works, 2 different products, different wavelengths that you can try. The people who give it a shot write to me, and they sing the praises of the green light to the point where you're like, that's got to be phony. That's got to be a paid for review or something. Nobody would ever. But gosh darn it, Mike, this thing to migraineurs, it is a miracle. Nothing will touch it.
Well, there's a lot of people who are suffering with migraines, and we don't have, we have some good treatments for them, and cannabis actually is one of them that can be really
Yep.
effective for some people. But yeah, we definitely need more of them. So I'm super happy that you're doing this.
I hope you take it to your practice. 10 minutes. They're often waiting in a waiting room or something for you anyway. You say, hey, while you're waiting, just meditate with this light on your face. And then you come in 10 minutes later, and then they might be, hopefully they'll say, doc, I feel pretty good. And you say, okay, you ready for your appointment now?
And Tom, where can people find you more online? What's your Instagram handle, your Twitter handle, and all that kind of stuff?
SeagerTP. That's me on Instagram and me on Twitter. But Twitter gets me in trouble. I mean, I got a lot to say, and I should probably shut up, because if I get another email from my dean at ASU, or my director calls me in for another meeting about something that I tweeted, I'm going to have to do an ice bath to prepare myself for the anxiety of the meeting. Instagram doesn't seem to get me in as much trouble as Twitter does.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the show, Tom. Thanks so much for creating excellent products. We learned a lot today about the cold plunge, also too about the benefits of using the cold plunge with the sauna, and obviously too with the green lamp. So really appreciate you coming on. And as always, thank you so much everyone for listening, and I'll be back again with another episode soon.